Okay, thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. This is the Fairhaven Lecture Series. My name is Carrie Bourne. I am from the Office of Continuing Education at UW Whitewater, and we have hosted the Fairhaven Lecture Series at Fairhaven Senior Services since 1983. This year, for obvious reasons, we are not at Fairhaven Senior Services, but we're still holding the lectures virtually every Monday afternoon. I am recording today's lecture so that then the video of the lecture can be aired at Fairhaven Senior Services in a few days. So thank you for those of us who are, those of you who are joining us live. We will take questions if you have any. Please use the chat box on the lower sort of right of your screen, and you can enter your questions there. And after the presentation, I will go ahead and read those questions to today's presenter. But let's go ahead and get started with today's lecture. This series, we're kind of focusing on traveling around the globe and throughout time while staying safe at home. So I think we're going to have a real adventure today with Professor Sue Wildermuth. Dr. Wildermuth studied intercultural communication as one of her PhD areas of concentration, and her area of research publication has been focused on intercultural communication competency for the past decade. She has been fortunate to be able to travel and work abroad extensively. Countries she has taught abroad in include England, Ireland, France, Germany, Iceland, Switzerland, Italy, Spain, the Czech Republic, Poland, Russia, Finland, Norway, South Korea, Ecuador, China, Brazil, Greece, Scotland, Malta, Vietnam, Mauritius, South Africa, Japan, and Mexico. Dr. Wildermuth has designed and led courses abroad for many years and is dedicated both professionally and personally to fostering respect for all forms of diversity in her classroom, in her 3 children, and in herself. She strives to do better every day. Please welcome Dr. Sue Wildermuth.
Hello, everybody. I'm so glad you're able to come, and thanks so much to Carrie and to Continuing Education at UW Whitewater for inviting me. Anytime you get an opportunity to share, photos from a great adventure you've had, it's always fun. When I talk to some of my students about, when they come back from a big adventure abroad, your parents and your loved ones don't always want to see your pictures as much as you want to talk about your adventures. They can kind of have fatigue. So any opportunity to talk about it is always fun. So I was very, very fortunate in that I had an opportunity to participate in a program called Semester at Sea. And it was about 3 years in the planning because I had to apply to work for this organization and get accepted and go through the interview process. And it was very rigorous. And then I also had to apply for a sabbatical to get the time off from this job to be able to have that position and that opportunity. And so the stars all had to align. And then, there were so many other variables as well that had to play a role. But the reason it was such a dream and the reason I worked so hard to try to accomplish it is because, when you hear about the idea that you're going to teach on I wouldn't say a cruise ship necessarily. It's not fancy. It doesn't have, a ton of bells and whistles, but it's certainly a beautiful floating university. And, these are your classrooms. So this was a large lecture hall that I taught in every day. And sometimes we had class out on the deck, or we had the observation deck where you can see the ocean right through the floor. And we had all these, just beautiful resources. And you think, I get to be a part of that. Look at these classrooms. Look at this campus. This is the top deck where you sit out under the stars. And it just seems very ideal, right? Like, oh my gosh, how is this possible that I get to have this opportunity and that my job will be, on this amazing, beautiful floating campus. And the plan for the experience was to visit 11 ports. So over the course of approximately 5 months, 1 full semester, the students would study intensively on the ship, and then they would have these immersion experiences at all of these various locations. And faculty would plan unique educational opportunities in all of these different ports. and we would all participate in this phenomenal learning experience. So like I said, a lot of stars had to align just right to make this happen. And I will also admit it's pretty costly. So, we had to work really, really hard, my husband and I, in the years up until going, where we took on extra jobs and part-time gigs and all these other things to try to make it feasible. And we had to figure out the kids and their schooling. So it was a lot of hoops to jump through so that we could provide this opportunity. And I also was able to negotiate and apply for another position after we disembarked in Amsterdam. I prepared to teach for 5 weeks at a university there and received a grant to do that coursework as well. So all these things were aligned, right? It was going to be the dream experience for myself and my husband and 3 kids and all the wonderful educational opportunities. Amazing, life-changing. Well, it was that, but it was spring of 2020. So it was this time last year. So it was not the reality that we had planned for. It was certainly very, very different than we ever could have imagined. This is the first of our notifications that our voyage was not going to be what we had thought it would. It's interesting, it says, we've been closely monitoring the spread of a new coronavirus, first identified in Wuhan. As of right now, it is not considered to be a public health emergency of international concern. However, the WHO director underscored the severity and uncertainty of the situation in China and said, make no mistake, this is an emergency in China, but has not yet become a global health emergency. It may yet become one. And of course, it certainly did. So that was our first notification that we would not be traveling to some of our ports of call. And shortly thereafter, we received other notifications saying that the ship was not going to be allowed to disembark. So the first couple of changes were because the program felt it was unsafe for us to go to those locations. But then future changes were because those countries felt it was unsafe to accept us based on what was happening on some other cruise ships at the time. And then our final notification was, it's a pandemic, it's an emergency situation. President Trump has declared that everyone must return. And so the program abruptly ended with about 72 hours notice that we would be disembarking in South Africa, and we had to find our own way home. So the reality of what we actually did was we had 4 international ports of call and then 2 national ports of call. So we went from 11 to 4. And this was our flight board on our way home. So we were dropped off, as I said, in South Africa. And we decided to stay for a little while as a family. And we just worked it, timed it just perfectly. We were so blessed that we got the last flight out of South Africa on Turkish Air, back to Chicago. And you can see as they were shutting down the airports and all the flights were canceled. So it was still, however, a life-changing experience. It was still a great educational opportunity, and I'm still so very, very grateful that I was able to participate in this. But it was very different than those imagination, kind of, the dream of what it was going to be like. So let me share a little bit about the shipboard community and about our experiences on ship, and then I'll talk briefly about each of the locations that we were able to visit. So on the ship, this may not be the best image, but you'll see on the, I guess it'd be the left for me, is our room, and we shared that with our youngest child. So it was a small, what they would consider to be a small suite, and it worked out very, very well. And then our kids shared one of the student dorms, our other 2 girls, and they bunked with another faculty member's daughter. And so they had 2 beds, and then one of them slept on the floor. So it wasn't quite the, we're going on a cruise kind of experience, but it was still wonderful, and we really enjoyed it. But it felt more like living in a dorm or going maybe camping, really, really glamping camping, where you have a really, really nice camper, but small, very small. There were many opportunities on the ship. Here are just a couple locations. You can see that's the outdoor seating for the restaurant, and you can see the indoor seating. The grand piano is there on the ship, and the music teachers use that classroom. And then there are exercise classes. There's a weight room, as well as they use the pool. So there's lots of different facilities on the ship, in addition to libraries, multiple classrooms, places to show educational films, etc. This is one of my classes. So we took a group photo, and in the middle there is one of my daughters, but this is one of my classes aboard the ship. It was challenging because we had a number of students who struggled with the transitions, as well as struggling ourselves and having to keep our family upbeat. We also, as faculty, really had to be there for 700 students and anxious parents and the constant changing. So the students would just adapt to something, and then we'd find out that it was something completely different. And so, things come up, right, when you're living in a living and learning community. So I had students in my room all the time talking about things from depression to drug use to family issues to relationship issues that seemed extra raw because of all the stress that was put upon them. But the shipboard community, we spent a lot of time on ship because we weren't allowed off in many of the places that we would have originally gone. So they came up with some really crazy fun things to do to offset the lessons, because of course we were still studying, it was still an academic experience, but we would have had more time off ship having international experiences. And so we did a lot of sort of co-curricular planning. So here's just a couple examples. They did do a graduation for all the students who were going to miss graduating. They also did something called Neptune Day, where they had us kiss a fish. And when we crossed the equator, people were able to shave their heads if they wanted to, because that was an old tradition where probably brought upon by lice and other issues, but people who were at sea for very long periods of time would shave their heads when they crossed the equator. So there's a whole variety of programming that was created on the fly by the faculty and team leadership. So we had a lot of fun doing some programming that was outside of what we were expecting to do, but we were able to pull together some really neat opportunities. One of my main jobs on the ship was to prepare people for their offshore experiences. I taught a class in cross-cultural communication, and I was co-director, of the Global Studies course. And that's the course that everyone on the ship has to take no matter what. There are other 3 classes they pick and choose from what's available and is of interest to them and matches their major or minor. But everybody takes Global Studies. And then the other piece of my job was I was the country and culture programmer. So I did a lot of evening presentations, workshops, roundtables, where we looked at these different cultures. And we learned so much, and then didn't wind up going to many of those places. And then we have new places, right? So like we thought, okay, we're not going to be able to go to China after all, but we're going to go to what are some of the places we learned about? The Seychelles Islands. Well, so we plan all this programming, deliver it all, and then they don't accept us. And there are multiple examples like that. So I learned a ton about places, and you learn a lot on the fly. There isn't good internet on the ship, so a lot of this is, really piecing together. But what I wanted to do in just the next 5 minutes or so is just give you a mini example of the kind of content that I was responsible for delivering. And then, like I said, we would do discussions and roundtables and other kinds of more interactive experiences after these more content-related presentations were given. So this is just a short sample of the presentation that we put together for Japan and that I did for Japan. And so we want to let the students know, okay, before you visit this culture, you've learned so much perhaps in your oceanography class about the impact of climate change and water resources and all of that on the Japanese islands and on the culture, right? And you're learning in your history class, of course, about the history and the dynasties and so on. But what about like on the ground, when you're there, what kinds of things do you need to know? And so we always started off with demographics. And with Japan, what's really interesting is they're about the same size geographically, in terms of square footage. They're about the same size as California. California has 39.56 million people who live in California. Japan has 126.2 million people, same size as California, so very densely populated. And they have a very long life expectancy. They're the longest life expectancy in the world. And so you have those two variables coming together, a large population and a long life expectancy. And space is at a premium. And what that means in terms of day-to-day on-the-ground experiences for my students was a whole variety of things that they were going to see and experience, and that we did while we were there. So for example, if you think about homes in Japan, they're often apartments, much smaller and much less storage space, right? Because you're a heavily dense population. So you have smaller homes with less storage. And so you don't have deep freezes, and you don't have the experience perhaps of going to Costco or Sam's Club and buying in bulk because you don't have anywhere to store it. So instead you have convenience stores or kombinis on every corner to make it very easy to pop down and grab that milk, or to pop down and grab that, whatever else it might be. So kombinis are so prevalent. In addition, so are vending machines. There are 6 million vending machines in Japan, which makes it essentially one vending machine for every 23 people. And they vend things you wouldn't normally think of, such as rice and sake and umbrellas and batteries and beer and dishes, vegetables, dress shirts and ties, fresh flowers, face masks, fresh bananas, you can see here, eggs, hot noodle dishes. Like, you can go on the street corner and get all sorts of supplies just straight out of the vending machine. Another interesting thing about this idea of densely populated and really thinking about space is the square watermelon was invented in Japan back in the late 70s, actually. So when you go to the grocery stores in Japan, you'll see these, and it's because it takes up less space in a refrigerator. So simple things like that you wouldn't necessarily consider when space is at a maximum. Other things you may have seen before are things like the famous crossing, in which about 2,500 pedestrians cross in this intersection in Tokyo every time the lights change. 2,500 people. It's the busiest crossing and the busiest train station in the world. And you actually have people who are hired, and we met and interacted with many of these very helpful people, who are called professional pushers. And they do many other jobs, of course, but one of their jobs is to push people on the really crowded subways so that the doors can shut and the train can take off. And so thankfully we weren't actually there in rush hour, in a morning rush hour, and didn't experience this, but we certainly were on very, very crowded subway trains, but we never saw pushers having to push. But just to think that that is a component of such densely populated areas. And when you are densely populated, another value is cleanliness and hygiene, because if you're very close contact to people, then you want to be smelling nice, etc. So one of the things that many of our students raved about when they came back onto the ship after visiting Japan was the toilets. It seems a strange thing to say, perhaps, but Japanese toilets were a hit. So back in the 1980s, the Washlet toilet was produced in Japan, and it is now the #1 selling brand, although there are now many generic versions as well. But in the homes that we stayed in, as well in all of the, even there were public toilets on the street, or if you went to a shop toilet, you were at a shopping center and you went to their toilet, everywhere you had these washlets or some version of them. They include a bidet, a heated seat, a blow dryer. They include odor reduction. They include decency noises, so that you can push a button and it can play music or something to disguise if you're making undecent noises, I guess. And they're very, very high efficient. So they're very clean and very good for the environment, and they save about 9 billion tons of toilet paper per year in Japan through using the washlet toilets. Another value we saw is we visited a large number of, different students went to different places, but we visited schools, and a practice there is that the school children clean their own room twice a day, and then they pick up after their lunches as well. So the idea is that, of course, you still have a janitor or janitors, pardon me, for the, intense kinds of jobs. But the classrooms, the sweeping, the washing the tables, the washing the dishes, putting away garbage from lunch, that's all something that's a responsibility of the school children in their classroom from day one. So again, just practicing this idea of cleanliness and hygiene. One other quick thing that was interesting to my students was the lack of garbage cans, public garbage cans. There is a very severe punishment for littering in Japan. It's a fine, and it comes with associated jail time, as well as community service after you leave. So it's a few days of jail time and then community service and a large fine. So you'd think that, okay, you can't litter, so there'd be garbage cans everywhere. But instead, because garbage cans attract pigeons and rats, there are very, very, very few public garbage cans. And so people are expected to, if they eat something or they purchase something and they're eating it, they're expected to pack their garbage into their backpack or their purse or whatever they're carrying with them, and then throw it out when they go home or when they go back to work. So that's something that was a bit of a surprise. And then you can see the connection, right? If you have densely populated and then you have a value of cleanliness, another piece of that puzzle is manners. Because if you spend a lot of time in close proximity to other individuals, it's very important to practice techniques that will maintain harmony and help people not get on each other's nerves. So we talk a lot about manners and rituals and how to behave. We had students do homestays and visit traditional religious sites, etc. And what are the rituals and the politeness behaviors that are expected there? And one enormous behavior that we really stress too is punctuality. So many of our students are college kids and they might sleep in a little bit or they might be running a bit late. And we were very clear on saying, if you are going to meet a train or you're taking the subway or you're taking a bus, it will leave when it says it's going to leave. So don't be late. There's no chance that you will make it if you are running a little bit late. And we, of course, showed the example from 2017 that made the international news when the Japanese National Train Service had to apologize because the train left 20 seconds early in this case. And that was a bit of a kerfuffle at the time. One more thing that we talked about was just sharing what are some of the cultural norms of or cultural, I guess, exports. So not in terms of technology and other things that we typically think of as exports, but what are some of the exports that are cultural, that they have a great deal of familiarity with and that may shape what the stereotypes that they have and what they're expecting from their visit to Japan. And so we talked about many different stereotypes that our students who came primarily from the US, but they were from all over the world. What are some of the stereotypes that you might have? One of the ones that comes up very often is this issue of kawaii, this issue of cuteness. So whether it's Hello Kitty or it's Pikachu or it's anime, our students really are very interested in Japanese pop culture because it has been exported so much to the US. And what does that mean in terms of how we think about kawaii and Japanese individuals? And so many of my students have no idea that, kawaii was actually a pushback or a reaction in the 1960s and 70s to the pressure placed on young women and men to perform academically. So, there's this huge pressure. And this was a cultural pushback saying, I'm going to be a little girl or a child forever. I don't want to grow up. And so kind of understanding what are some of the historical things behind that. And then, of course, many of our students also associate Japan with Totoro. And so we talk a little bit about Shintoism and Buddhism and the religious practices in Japan. So that's the kind of work that I did while I was on the ship, was a lot of cultural training, a lot of breaking down perceptions, trying to do reflection, making connections and intersectionality between what perceptions we already hold, what do we know to be true, what are you learning in these other courses, and then how can we apply that to our lived experience and bring that back as we debrief after an experience abroad. And then, like I said, there was a lot of processing that had to do with culture shock and navigating relationships that was as much about COVID as it was about the international experiences that we had. And now I'll just like to spend maybe 10 minutes or so taking you through the five, a brief bit of Hawaii, the 5 locations that we visited and what my takeaways were. And then I would love to answer questions at the end. So I feel like I had a transformative experience in every location that we visited. For Hawaii, when you went to Hawaii, it was a 1-day fuel stop. And so we all had the opportunity to participate in design programs that were tied to a particular interest. And so we actually participated, we partnered with Sustainable Coastlines Hawaii, and my courses and some other individuals' courses went to a non-touristy part of Hawaii on the side of the island that comes up against the Great Pacific and where the Great Pacific garbage patch washes up onto the shores of Hawaii. And we spent a very intense day working with that nonprofit and seeing the real impact of our throwaway plastic culture on the oceans and on the coastlines of Hawaii. So what you can really see here is, of course, there are bottles and there are toothbrushes and there are large pieces of plastic, but the real challenge is that embedded about 4 inches down into the sand are all those microplastics. So the ocean has beat the bejeebies out of those straws and those plastic bottles and those toothbrushes and those fishing buoys and have turned them into teeny tiny, some you can get with your fingers, but so many of them are so small you have to use a screen to shift through the sand. And it's heartbreaking. It feels impossible. It literally feels like they're, needles in a haystack, and there's just billions and billions and billions of them. And there are people out there every day donating their time and trying to stem a flood with a finger. And so it was just really powerful. And I think we all walked away from that experience making a determined individual effort to reduce our use and take it much more seriously perhaps than I had before, to really think that, yeah, when you go through that drive-through and you say yes to that straw, it just feels like a straw, but it's not. It's a tiny piece of plastic that's going to get thrown away in about 15 minutes when you're done with that soda, along with the cup and the bag and the packaging. It's all going to go in the garbage. So, from the moment it got used to the moment it gets thrown away, it can be 10 minutes. So we really walked away with that determination to do better. Then we went to Japan, and we were able to spend a little extra time there because we weren't going to China. And there are some wonderful things that we learned there. We really experienced a lot of the Buddhism and the different religious beliefs. We went to a couple different festivals. Our timing was just fortuitous that we got to go to some different fire festivals when they were celebrating the rebirth and spring, and they set the mountainside on fire. We got to see some traditional practices, which were really enjoyable. We got to see sustainable agriculture, so the growing of bamboo. Not only is it beautiful, but it grows really, really fast, and it's really, really strong, and is a great resource for building materials. We also did some fun things. So here we went to an anime museum, and the kids got themselves their caricature and anime. But my big takeaway from Japan was really that we were so blessed as a family, and then also many of my students who were able to do homestays. So in our case, we actually stayed with a family that we knew already and were able to reconnect with some friends of ours. But just that experience of a culture from someone's home, not just all the tourist attractions that you might otherwise see, even if those tourist attractions are really valuable in terms of their educational, historical, cultural, perspectives. It's still, you see such a different aspect when you stay in someone's home. So my big takeaway from Japan was really about the importance of maintaining relationships, putting the time in, taking the time out, sending that text, making that call. It's so easy to take people for granted. And so I really walked away from Japan determined to do better at being a better friend, a better daughter. I don't know if mom's watching. She said she was going to. If so, I hope I've done better. But, just being more in touch with the people that we care about and maintaining those connections. So that was my big Japan takeaway. And I think that many of the students who stayed with families had a similar experience about how much richer it is when you see life from the home of someone who lives in that culture. Our next visit was to Vietnam. And again, we were very lucky in that we got to stay longer in Vietnam than originally planned, because we were not able to go to anywhere else after Japan and Vietnam. We were no longer allowed in Asia, basically. So this was our first experience with Corona. So Japan had inklings of it, but it was between Japan and Vietnam, when we made the decision not to go to China, and when countries began putting in place. So this was, I guess it would be early December. So you got off the ship, and you could see my daughter's not covering her nose with her face mask, those things we didn't know yet, but you wore a mask. There was hand sanitizer everywhere, and this was everywhere in Vietnam. So when we were doing programs that were with Semester at Sea individuals, or we were on our own as a family, we were not required to wear a mask. But you'll see that in many of the different things that we do, that we were always masked and hand sanitized. For Vietnam, there were so many takeaways. It's hard to really put it down into one, because this was just such a myriad of experiences. So I started off with a little bit of nature. The white sand dunes, I'd never been to a desert, and so seeing this was really just impactful for me. We also did a lot of cultural and religious experiences, and so we, of course, saw some of the more common religious sites in Vietnam. And it was the first time that my kids had seen the more decorative side of Christianity. So when I'd been to Ecuador, I'd seen some of the more orthodox and decorative, but my children are more used to the, Jesus is always dressed very plainly, very simple. And so that was a neat learning experience for them. We also were very fortunate in that we had arranged to attend a Cao Dai temple. So Cao Dai is a Vietnamese religion. It's established in Vietnam and is a compilation of teachings that are original to the religion, as well as borrowed from Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, Christianity. And so we were very fortunate to be able to attend the temple, to watch a service, and then speak with the practitioners afterwards. We also went to a Buddhist themed amusement park, which was a hoot. So that was just a wonderful experience, and we interacted with, it was very, very empty because of the virus. So it was part of a class trip that our program participated in. And it was a great day, but it was just, you wouldn't normally think of a Christian theme park where there are rides and slides and etc. is just a little unusual to think of, and yet this was a Buddhist theme park. And so the children had a really great experience there. And we did some amazing, beautiful things that we were able to do. And the kids were encouraged. And this one, the tour guide was encouraging the kiddos to be a little silly. So the next piece for Vietnam was history. And I think this was my largest takeaway, was to really understand the connection between Russia and Vietnam and the historical context. My husband's father fought in the Vietnam War and spoke a great deal about it when my husband was growing up, and so to really see that outside of the textbooks, we went to the Cu Chi tunnels, we went to many different sites related to both recovery after the devastation of the war, and then also covering the historical context. And so that was very, very powerful for me. Here you'll see the mangroves. Talon's got a shovel there. And so much of the mangroves and other areas of the vegetation were destroyed. And the mangroves in particular are so important to keeping the erosion and to keeping the ocean from creeping in, right? And cleaning they just play so many different roles in the ecosystem. So to have hundreds upon thousands of acres of mangroves destroyed. There have been multiple reclamation efforts and conservation efforts. And so we participated in a program in which we went out and planted mangroves in the very hot sun. We had some students pass out actually. But again, it was a powerful, powerful learning experience. And then the other two pictures there were just to show you how it's was so busy. I would never, kind of like you say, I would never want to drive there, you really had to be a savvy driver to negotiate the busy streets. The other takeaway from Vietnam would have been that we really saw, like in Japan, we were blessed to be able to spend time with real families. And so we had a connection through one of my previous travels with a family in Vietnam, and we were able to stay with them, and you can visit their village and visit. You'll see here in the middle the fishing village, and you can see the homes on the river here. So this is where we were staying in these homes here, and then up above is where they were making alcohol at home. So Jason is a home brewer, so he was very interested in that. And down below, they took us to a neighbor who has an incense factory in their home. And then you can see the kiddos here. So it was just a wonderful experience. And when we went to their home and their village, we also were able to, it's not clicking for me here. Maybe I'm not clicking the right thing. Next. We also were able to participate in the morning in the net fishing. So they leave the nets out overnight, and then in the early mornings they pull them in. So this is a photo I took of them working on pulling in the nets, and then there's a picture of some of the things that they caught that day. So it's a pretty cool experience. And then this is us enjoying some of those delicious catches. So we had some really delicious food, and my kiddos were intrigued. Down at the bottom there, they're having roasted goat, which was, I think, the first time. They're very good troopers. They're willing to do almost anything I drag them along to do. But that one, there was a lot of anxiety. None of us spoke Vietnamese, and we were often with family and friends who helped facilitate our travels. But this time we were on our own for a couple of days, and I'm a bit of an adventurous soul, and I said, well, let's just go here, we'll figure it out. And we had the most wonderful people who were trying to help us figure it out. And eventually she was just like, no, and she took the paper, it was just a piece of paper, she took it away, and she just took it away and said, like, wait, and then she brought us food, and we had no idea, really what we were eating or how to do it, but she was an absolute doll and trained us and took us through, and it all worked out. So that was Vietnam. And then our next location was Mauritius, and Mauritius is very small. It's you can drive across the entire island in 90 minutes. And so my takeaways from Mauritius were really about conservation and ecotourism. And I don't know if any of you followed the news this summer when there was the large oil spill in Mauritius, but it's such an important part of their economy, and it's so much of the island is nature preserves, conservation areas. So they have both the oceanic conservation areas, and then they have huge swaths of the island itself that are also conservation. So essentially, it's all ecotourism. It's all about going to see animals in their native environments, and a lot of ocean tourism. So here we are visiting with some of at the land tortoise. We went to a rehabilitation center there and learned a lot about them. We saw and interacted with many rare and not so rare monkeys. There are monkeys everywhere, and some of them are like raccoons or possums here. And then others are more rare species that are being protected. And it isn't just the animals, they also have some very unique geological formations. So this is the colored sand dunes that are unique to Mauritius from the volcanic activity. And then you can see the giant lily pads as well as the giant flowers. So, many beautiful specimens that were preserved. And then the last thing that we did in Vietnam is we did have some cultural experiences with our college students as well. And so we learned to dance, we learned a lot about various religious practices, and then we did visit an important industry to Mauritius, which is the tea plantations. So when they were part of Britain and then part of the trade, a large part of their industry was tea, and so you can still try many delicious types of tea. And then last but not least, again, we kind of risked it, and when they kicked us off the ship in South Africa, we said, we're halfway around the world. I don't know that we'll ever get back here. We're gonna risk it. And so we played the waiting game, and we stayed for 10 days in South Africa and just barely made it out, so our timing was perfect. And in South Africa, we certainly had a takeaway that would have been similar to Mauritius in terms of all of the different conservation opportunities. So many places that we're working so hard to save species that are endangered. So it really brought that home, and how important that work is, and how these countries are in many cases they don't have as many resources as other countries might, and yet they're protecting species for the world. And so how important it is for all of us to contribute in some way. So these are many of the species that we went to different conservation places and got to interact with, whether it was marmots or cheetahs, ostrich, or the kiddos there are actually standing on a whale skull. We did a little bit of cultural experiences. So we had tried some of the different, South Africa is known for its beers and its honey. So there are many honey beers and meads. And so Jason, again, as a brewer, was trying those, and the kids got to have some music lessons. But my largest takeaway for South Africa was the poverty. So you are able to see a level of poverty that we do not experience in our lived experiences here in Wisconsin as a family. And so to see that and really understand that people live in circumstances like this, with no electricity, no indoor plumbing, and multiple people or families to small homes, within proximity to large bustling cities with all of those amenities. it really spoke to the work that still needs to be done and how we can, as a family and as a community and as educators, contribute to those initiatives. So despite the fact that it wasn't 11 countries in 5 months, it was 4 countries in 3, and we didn't go to Amsterdam, and we didn't have that 5-week experience, and it was very different than what we planned. It was still phenomenal. So I felt so grateful to be able to work with the students and the faculty that I worked with on Semester at Sea, and to make the connections that I was able to make, as well as to have this time with my own family. They're a crazy bunch, my kids, and we spent some intense one-on-one time with them, and it was just a blessing. So despite the fact that it wasn't what I had thought it was going to be, it was still the best, greatest adventure of my lifetime to date. And so I'm going to just end there, and I just wanted to end with a great ending, right? A great exit sign. So as we were leaving South Africa, we spent some time at a conservation location, and as you left, it said, "Do you have your keys, your wallet, your charger, and your wife?" So that's the end of my presentation, and I am very happy to answer any questions people might have. I will end the share screen here.
Thank you, Sue. That was incredible. Wow, that was really, really an adventure for those of us watching. I'm sorry that it ended, actually. I'm going to remind everyone who's in the audience that if you have questions, if you'll enter them in the chat box, and we'll go through those. We have a couple questions now that I can go through, but please do feel free to enter others. We actually have a student who's a sophomore here at Whitewater, and she is planning on, her name is Katie, and she's planning on going on the Semester at Sea in the spring of 2022.
Oh my
So
gosh.
she probably has learned a lot, already since she posted this question. But she would like to know, what is the biggest takeaway this voyage gave you? What is a con of Semester at Sea? And what advice would you give students that want to go on Semester at Sea?
Okay, I'm going to start with the con, so then I can end with the pro and the greatest takeaway. I think the one thing to be very clear about when you're selecting a study abroad experience is to understand the distinction between a, I guess what you'd call an island model and an immersion model. And Semester at Sea is absolutely an island model. So you are living with primarily a whole bunch of other Americans and a whole bunch of other American professors. And so a lot of your learning is really based on, how do Americans understand this? How, so like the process is that sort of island model where you're living in this island and then dipping your toes into all of these other places and bringing it back to your lived experience as an American. It's not an immersion model, and an immersion model has great value in that if you go and live in Ecuador for a semester, you're going to have a much different transformative experience. They're both transformative, but they're very different. They're both valuable, but you just want to really make sure that this is the kind of experience you want, because it does feel, there was an old movie, I don't know, 60s or something, that was called "If It's Tuesday, It Must Be Belgium." And it feels that way, like, we were blessed in that we got to stay for longer in many of the places we went to. Mauritius was supposed to be a one-day stop, a fuel stop. We were there for a week and a half because they let us in, and we could get off the ship. But think of that, if you have one day in Mauritius, I mean, you barely skim the surface, and you've got 5 days in Japan and 4 days in this location and 4 days in Ghana and 4 days, so it's very much a dipping your toe in. So just keeping that in mind. In terms of advice for students, I would say, the field programs are where the learning happens, but they are pricey. So you have to find that balance between signing up for these phenomenal field experience. I mean, semester at sea gets access to stuff that a regular person would never have access to. You can go stay in a temple with the monks. You can go, some of the things that we were going to do, we didn't do, but you're able to go stay with these host families and have these, we met Robert Fulghum, we met Jack Johnson, the guy that making banana pancakes, pretend like it's the weekend. I don't know, like a super famous musician, right? He did Curious George, and so you meet these people because semester at sea. We've talked to Desmond Tutu, for heaven's sakes. We met the King of Sweden, like stuff you can't do without the semester at sea name behind you. But those field experiences can be expensive too, and you want to do some exploring on your own as well. So I would just say advice is like, pick and choose, but definitely sign up for some field experiences. And then in terms of my biggest takeaway really was how very, very, very blessed I am and how I need to practice gratitude in my life much more. And I've been trying to really, we came back in a pandemic and we've been in a pandemic ever since. And, it's easy to be like, oh, this sucks. And, but to say, wait a minute, we're so blessed.
Yeah, and I think we know the answer to this question, but was it worth the money, and would you go again? That's another follow-up question.
Oh yeah, I mean, that's the thing. I have to wait another 7 years until hopefully I'm eligible for another sabbatical, and then hopefully, again, the stars have to align. I have to get the sabbatical, I have to get the job, all those things. It's like, oh my gosh, is this ever going to happen again? But absolutely. My kids are already like, Mom, if you're teaching, then, because the two oldest ones will be in college 7 years from now. So they're like, Mom, you have to do it, because if you're teaching, then I get a discount. It's like, well, it's all about you, I guess. But yes, absolutely, I would go again.
And another question is about how many students go on the semester at sea each time?
Yeah, a full ship is 700 and a smidge of students. So the World Odyssey, which is the ship that we traveled on, can support somewhere around 700 students, because then you also have faculty and their families and the staff on the ship. So we had a full course load. I guess usually in the fall it's a little bit less, and then in the spring generally it's a full program. And I think that's just because for many students the spring semester is more when it works into their schedule than the fall.
Yeah, kind of going back to some of the really interesting material you shared in your Japan lesson. Someone was wondering, is commenting that vending is usually really expensive. Is that true in Japan too?
It is not, no. The kombinis and the vending machines are both very inexpensive. So we did almost all of our meals through kombinis. So you go in and you can get a whole meal. I mean, granted, we weren't eating like fancy or anything, but you can get, ramen noodles, and they have the hot water right there, and you just put your hot water in, and then they have little tables that you can sit outside and eat it. So yeah, you could have a whole meal for all 5 of us could eat for under $10. But we ate a lot of ramen, so it's like probably not the best for us in terms of our salt intake.
You gotta indulge a little bit, I guess, if you're traveling. So I'll kind of end with this question of my own, which is, you clearly, traveling is very important to you. You value it. You've traveled all over the world. How I remember listening not long ago to like a podcast with Rick Steves, whose life's work is traveling and helping people to enjoy travel and make it easier and things. So as a traveler, a world traveler yourself, what are you doing during these times that you can't travel, and how are you, itching that scratch or scratching that itch or whatever, to travel when you really can't? What advice would you give to others who really who do find the value in traveling and traveling as transformative experiences and things?
Mm-hmm. To be honest, I've done a lot of exploring around here. So I do. I just feel the need to go. And so we've done a lot of camping. And I think sometimes, well, again, if mom's here, I don't know, but she puts it best because, I'm always like, go, 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 go. And she's right that sometimes I don't even know that there's a county park, 15 minutes away from me because I am not exploring my own beautiful, beautiful state. Instead, I'm going out to Yellowstone or I'm going whatever. And so I think that the pandemic and last summer really provided our family with the opportunity to realize that, again, how blessed we are to live where we live and to have the Kettle Moraine State Forest 5 minutes away from Whitewater, and to have Bong State Recreation, a half an hour away, and Lake Geneva, and all of these beautiful, so many. We went to see the sunflowers in between Fort and Jefferson, and we just did so many marvelous things nearby. So I think I do all this planning, like we're going to go and have this amazing transformative experience in Amsterdam, and I plan for 3 months. And if I put that same amount of time into researching where I live, we'd have some pretty transformative experiences right here. So we did a better job doing that this summer.
That's a great way to end this lecture and makes us feel like there's an adventure waiting for us. We don't have to get on a plane or a train or anything. There's probably one in our backyard in the form of melting snow today, right?
Right.
So I just want to say thank you, Sue Wildermuth, for sharing your experience with us. I on behalf of Fairhaven, I'm sure the folks over there will really enjoy learning more about your trip. And I'm really hoping we can have you back in person at a time when it's a little safer. Thank you for those of us who joined us today. And please, if you want to revisit this lecture, we'll have it posted on our website soon. Thanks everyone for joining us.
Yeah. Bye. Thank you.